Good afternoon, everybody. I am Rubén Hernández León. I'm a professor of sociology at UCLA and director of the Latin American Institute. And it's my distinct pleasure today to present our speaker in today's presentation, which is part of our series on transnational migrant children navigating school systems. And we have had a very successful series of events throughout the academic year. We started, if I recall correctly, back in September, and we are in April right now, and we are continuing strong and enthusiastically with the series. This series is actually part of the outreach program of the Latin American Institute, and my colleague Veronica Zavala, who is here, is the coordinator of the outreach program. She will be in charge of the Q&A part of today's presentation. And today it's a special day, a special presentation, because we have Dr. Sophia Ángeles, who is actually a graduate of UCLA. She received her doctorate here at UCLA at the school of our own School of Education. She's currently a faculty at the university at Penn State University. So hopefully the weather is slowly changing over there, Sophia, and getting a little bit warmer. So it's great to have you here. We're very happy to have you as our speaker, and Sophia will present on her work on transnational youth, newcomer youth in a high school in Los Angeles. And she's here to give you all the details of the presentation. We'll proceed as usual. Sophia will talk for about half an hour, 35 minutes or so, something like that. And then we will go to the Q&A. So use the Q&A function of the Zoom, please, to pose questions to our speaker today. Sophia, again, we're very happy to have you here, and take it away.
Thank you. So I'm gonna share my screen. Does it work? Thank you so much for inviting me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for being here with me today. I'm presenting to you from State College, Pennsylvania, on the unceded lands of the Lenape and Shawnee peoples, the traditional caretakers of these lands. And today I'll be presenting on findings from a year-long ethnographic study that was conducted at a large comprehensive high school in South Los Angeles. And before I jump into the findings, I want to contextualize a little bit about why I came to this work. I grew up in the early 1990s as a child of Mexican immigrants in California, and I witnessed firsthand the struggles people like my own mother experienced as a non-native English speaker. In my own schooling experience, I lived through the start of the English-only movement, or the policy that came with the passage of Proposition 227. And while I was never in bilingual education, I actually did see how the bilingual education program got dismantled in my own elementary school. Years later in high school, I was asked to TA in a Sadai history class. And it was actually there that I really became attuned to the experiences that my peers were having in relation to mine. So being in that classroom, I got to witness how, even though my peers were Latino, just like me, even though we were bilingual, we were having vastly different educational experiences, even just like relationships with teachers. And really the big thing being that I was college bound, and a lot of them were actually thinking about college or pursuing college after high school. And so across a variety of contexts, I've dedicated my professional and now my scholarship to trying to address this problem of double marginalization, one for being an English learner and then two for being an immigrant. And so I've, gone from California to the Northeast, Southeast, I'm now back in the Northeast. And all of these experiences have really contributed to my understanding of just how diverse the newcomer youth population is, but also how their multiple identities are shaping their experiences, and often they're, even within that newcomer population, they're having different or divergent educational trajectories. And so before we actually talk about the findings, I'm gonna ask if you can help me contextualize the problem a bit. There is a little, I'm gonna do like a poll me, and there is a link if that's easier. So I just kind of wanna ask you all, which 5 states in the US at the moment have the largest percentage of K through 12 students that are designated as ELs. Again, newcomer youth kind of are both immigrants and labeled as English learners. So we'll just start off with, what are the 5 states right now that have the largest percentage of K through 12 students? So if you, hopefully it works. So if you want to respond, and so we'll see if and I think the link is EB versus EN. I don't know if that yeah. You can also, I suppose, if it's easier to just chat in the response. I'll give it a couple of more seconds. C, okay. So some people are saying C. And so actually it's, the answer is, and this was recent, it's actually now Texas has the largest percentage of students that are designated as ELs in comparison to the general student population, even though California actually has the largest number of students that are ELs. So California has 1.2 million, Texas actually has 1 million, but in terms of percentage, it's Texas, California, New Mexico, Nevada, and then Illinois. And as you can see, 4 of those states are, in the Southwest, which is the home of many Spanish-speaking families. And so the next question has to do, EL is English learner, so someone who's learning English. And so the next question has to do with where you all think the majority of K through 12 students that are labeled English learners, are they attending elementary? Are they attending secondary? And again, you can use a chat. So A for elementary, B for secondary. Where do you think the majority are? B. It's actually so yes, a lot of people are saying B, and it's actually A. So 70% of students that are labeled as ELs are actually attending elementary. So, this is kindergarten to 6th grade. And then a third of them, so 35% or 34% are actually attending secondary schools. And in terms of research, most of the research actually takes place in elementary context. And we actually know a lot more about the experiences of elementary EL students and what those best practices are, which brings us to kind of this point about how the EL population of secondary is smaller, but that doesn't mean that we should be ignoring their needs. In fact, scholars and I argue that because they tend to be a smaller population, they tend to be vulnerable to being overlooked. And here you can see the A through G eligibility rates, and this just means if you're eligible to attend a UC or a CSU, the public university systems here in California. And here you see the rates for the senior class that made up the class of 2022. You see that it's just disaggregated by race. So, among white students, 57% were eligible or met the requirements for the UC and the CSU. Among the Asian population, 77%, the Latino population, 43%. When you compare this to the general senior class of 2022, it's at 51%. So now the question is, Now the question is what you all think is a rate for high school seniors who are still classified as ELs. So I kind of saw a variety of different rates. You can all feel free to take a guess in terms, and I'll call it out in the chat. So any guess? So 19%. So I'll go ahead and show you the answer. So remember that the general senior, like the general student population of the senior class, that was 51%. And here we see that it's at 26% for English learners, which is much lower. If you remember, Latinos were at 44%. I think African Americans were also in the 40% range. And so again, these 1 in 4 students or seniors that are EL still are meeting the requirements to attend a UC or CSU. And this is something that scholars have been starting to pay attention. There was actually a recent report that the Center for Equity for English Learners that is based out of Loyola Marymount out in LA. They published a brief in 2020 that was actually looking at this. So looking at both graduation rates and then looking at the A through G eligibility rates. And again, the numbers don't compare in terms of ELs when you're looking at even just the group of Latino students, or even looking at students that have a lower socioeconomic status. We see that students that are labeled as EL are not meeting eligibility at the same rates. And so this is very much an issue of educational inequities. So this is just painting a picture of where I'm coming from. And if you have any questions, we do have time for Q&A, but if you want to reach out with any questions or want to talk more, here's my email. And so to talk a little bit about Esperanza High School, this is a pseudonym for the school site, and I'll also be using pseudonyms for my collaborators. And this was a large project that focused on what the aspirations were of newcomer youth. So really looking at their college and career aspirations, looking at the access that they had to develop their college and career readiness, and then also how school staff was attending to that. And you know, the question for today is, what are the futures that newcomer youth are envisioning for themselves? And so to really ground us and make sense of what we will be seeing is using transborder frameworks. Scholars, Dryness and Dryness Sepúlveda write about how it's important to understand, quote, diaspora young people, how their lives transcend national borders, and again, really making sense of their transnational experiences. Oftentimes, you know, we talk about youth, especially with the, you know, the legal term or unaccompanied youth as being divorced from transnational communities. There has been talk about youth being unparented. Recently, Dr. Stephanie Canizales and Dr. Daisy Diaz-Strong have talked about how that's a misconception that needs to be addressed. And so really this transborder lens allows us to really attend to their transnational experience. The other thing is that thinking about transborder frameworks allows us to really see how youth are being creative in terms of navigating these like very real, you know, ways that borders tend to contain and constrain. And then the other thing is how, and I'll be showing and talking about this, but really moving beyond nation state or US centric ways of making sense of the futures that newcomer youth have. And so, you know, I was at Esperanza the year prior to the pandemic, and I had thought that I'd be, you know, collecting data and being at the school, you know, collecting data in person. But as some of you who are educators, the pandemic changed everything. And so I was still attending class, this time, you know, over Zoom. Maybe you all relate to this picture. I ended up doing 75 interviews with youth that were in 9th to 12th grade, 22 interviews with educators. I was able to also look at high school transcripts, schoolwork, attend college presentations. And so in terms of who the newcomer youth at Esperanza were, you can see that it's pretty much even, or in terms of the youth that I talked to across gender lines, most of them were from Guatemala, but then that was followed by Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. We see that the large majority were emergent bilingual, so they were both Spanish and English. And then we see that, you know, a little less than a third were emergent multilinguals. So they were already bilingual in Spanish and either Quiche, Canjobal, or Mam, and now they were learning English. And again, thinking about this idea of them being unparented, the majority of them were actually living with a parent or parents. And then there were others who were living with older siblings or extended family like an aunt or a grandmother. And thinking about legal status, they occupied, like their legal status was on the spectrum, right? So we do know that 45 of them were here temporarily. So they had a case, they were seeking asylum. But then we also see that there were other newcomer youth that were more privileged and that they were US citizens or had a green card. And then there were others who weren't, they didn't have a case, they were undocumented, they arrived here without, you know, ever being, presenting themselves to an official. And then there were others who actually came through a different program, the Central American Minors Program, which was terminated during the Trump administration, but then started again during the Biden administration. And then just to reiterate, most of them actually did come as 13 to 17-year-olds, and so they're part of the 1.25 generation. And so now, you know, returning to this question, I do want to acknowledge that it is a privilege to be thinking about futures, especially given the conversation that I just had about acknowledging the variety of legal statuses the newcomer youth occupied. So there is some uncertainty that comes with being in legal limbo, right? So not just being uncertain about your present day, and this also translating to being uncertain about your futures. And yet I do want to recognize the fact that newcomer youth still had aspirations. So with this being said, if you can take some time to, in the chat, just think about what futures, what careers youth were thinking about in terms of, what they wanted to pursue after high school. So any ideas, if you've had any conversations with youth, what are they talking about in terms of their future? Okay, so we see people talking about them wanting to become lawyers, educators, pursue careers in medicine, journalism, business, family business, social workers. Yes. So, oh, okay. Yeah, working. Some of them do have that, following in their parents' footsteps. So this is a word cloud that actually represents the different careers newcomer youth talked about. And so you can see the big one is doctor, but some of them were undecided, and then some few of them actually mentioned entering directly the workforce. But as you can see here, most of these careers require post-secondary education and or training, right? Some of them require 4-year degrees. Doctor requires a medical school, but for the most part, you need to at least attend like a 1-year program at a community college or pursue an apprenticeship. So with that being said, and I want to turn over to the discussion of migrating and transnational dreams. So we'll start off with Eddie, who I was a senior at the time of the interview, and he actually graduated at the onset of the pandemic. And so we're talking about his high school experience, and he ends up reflecting on what it means to study high school here in the US. And he really talks about having this second chance, second opportunity. He actually shared how in El Salvador, he was going to enroll in college. But he talks about how he was barely able to qualify for college admittance because his grades were so low. And as he states, he enters rozando, like barely entering. And he interprets this opportunity to study high school here in the US as being able to have, like a redo, and really being motivated to do it better, right? And so I bring your attention to this, to Eddie, because I want to showcase the cultural capital he had. He was familiar with the college going process, even though it was, back in El Salvador, and, things might look differently here in the US. But also the fact that Eddie had been thinking about pursuing college or attending college since, before he migrates to the US. And just like he's migrating, so is his aspiration of attending college. We have Anna here, who migrated to the US as an unaccompanied minor. And here we're talking about if the goals that she had now were similar to the ones that she had in El Salvador. So when I interview her, she's thinking about the legal field or entering or enlisting in the army. And she talks about how back then she was thinking about still the legal field, but the medical or the health field as well. And she talks about the conversations that she had with her grandmother, who was a nurse back home, and just even herself recognizing that when you're younger, you feel like everything is, you know, you want to be everything. But then as you're growing up, you end up realizing like what interests you have. And this is when she talks about how she realizes that the health field is not something that she would like to pursue, which again is developmentally normal, as you know, young people are figuring out what their interests are. But again, these are career interests that she was already exploring back in El Salvador. And as I ask her, you know, this is something that you arrived with, and she says, yeah, I already had these thoughts, ya lo tenía. The other thing that I want to talk about is transnational post-secondary futures, and how youth were envisioning post-secondary futures that really transcended this idea of just having to remain in the US or go to colleges here in the US. Here we see Dulce, who is a US citizen, but did the majority of her K-12 education in Mexico. And she shared her goal and about how it had always been becoming a psychologist. And her goal had been to finish high school and return to Mexico to be able to get a good paying job, because she would be leveraging her English skills. And so again, working through college is something that's, very normal. We see with a lot of first-gen college students. But then she also recognized that being able to pursue her post-secondary education might be easier, right? Because she'd be able to use the language that she was familiar with, and as she states, she would be able to ask questions, right, without having any difficulties. And no longer would she be seen as a language learner like she is in the US. The interesting thing is that when she shares these aspirations with her counselors, Mr. Sandoval really pushes her to think about staying in the US. He reiterates that she would have a much better future here, and that then therefore she'd be able to help out her family. But using a transborder framework, we might question why Mr. Sandoval was really just kind of focusing on her pursuing post-secondary education here in the US versus really thinking about what it would mean for her to pursue studies in Mexico. And again, she never received any information about what that would look like. All of the information was about attending a CSU or a UC. The other thing is that we see Beto, who was also a US citizen, who was from Mexico, and he's also entertaining these ideas of whether he should go into accounting, computer programming, but he's thinking about this obstacle that he names of his ability to remain in connection with his family. And so he feels that if he were to study accounting, he would actually end up spending more time in the US than in Mexico. And at the time, he was actually in Mexico because he noticed that if he attended school online, he could, do it from Mexico rather than being in California, and which plays into his thinking with computer programming, that again he could be able to pursue this career long distance, right, but still remain in Mexico. And I'm trying to clarify. And again, I ask him just to make sure that I'm understanding how he's making sense of, being here, being there, and being able to pursue this career. And he, tells me that yes, so long as that he had access to the internet, being able to communicate via phone with his clients, he would be able to work on, the products that they were asking, whether that's creating a website or things like that. So it's his own experience in that moment, being able to, again, be back and forth, but still be connected to a US school while living in Mexico. I think what's important about Beto is that family, being able to be connected to family is very much on his mind, because his parents, who now are in Mexico, when they were in the United States, they were formerly undocumented. So there really is no way for them to be able to reunite if Beto were to, remain in California. And so again, he's trying to make sense of what a future might look like, where, he's thinking beyond the national borders and how it constrains people. The other thing, since we, there's a theme of family, I want to bring attention to the notion that these youth are part of transnational families, and they're part of transnational families that are ever changing. And so the work of Lacey Abrego, and then Lauren Heidbrink is very much informs what it means to be part of a transnational family. So sociologist Lacey Abrego talks about the transnational family strategy, and how this is a response, quote, to economic circumstances. And she was studying Salvadoran parents who, migrate to the US and are, end up creating a transnational family. And then anthropologist Lauren Heidbrink looks at youth from Guatemala, Maya youth, and she argues that, quote, Maya youth are managing and employing a transnational migration as a survival strategy. So with that in mind, I'll now turn to these three last examples, and we'll start off with Luna, who arrives as an unaccompanied minor. And when she's telling her story about her migration journey, she talks about how, in reunifying with her parents, she ends up leaving family behind in Guatemala, specifically her brother, who she wanted to bring along so that he could accomplish his goals. But as she shares, this is not something that he wanted to do. And again, as she's telling her story, we come to find out that when her parents leave for the US, they leave her and her brother under the care of her grandmother. And it is for this reason, actually, that her brother decides not to leave to the US, because leaving would mean that their grandmother ends up staying alone. And as you can see here, Luna does agree. She says, la verdad, yo tampoco la quería dejar. I didn't want to leave her. And at the same time, Luna has this dream of becoming a doctor, and she feels that it was necessary for her to migrate to the US to be able to accomplish this dream, to be able to become a doctor, as you can see here, to be able to work. And then because she would be able to work as a doctor, she'd be able to help her grandmother by sending, some of the earnings she'd be making, and in turn caring for her, right? Just as her grandmother had once cared for her and her brother, she'd be able to support her, and her grandmother would be able to, as she says, ella descansar, rest. And so in this other example, we see Manuel, who, like Luna, is already part of an existing transnational family, but he's actually not reuniting with his parents. He's reuniting with 4 older siblings. And we too talked a little bit about, what motivated his journey or his migration to the US. And he talks about how this has always been a goal of his, and how even in Guatemala, he was already contributing to his family, to his mom specifically. He talks about how they had money, not so much, not a lot, but they had some. And as we continue to talk in the interview, we end up talking about what his long-term goals are, right, after high school. And because he is unaccompanied and he has a case that he's trying to fight, he does name how remaining in the US is one of his goals. But it's also becoming a homeowner, again, being able to travel, have papeles, right, have adjusted his legal status, being able to visit his mom. And again, the theme of being able to continue to help his mother, as he says, con los recursos, con todo. And again, if we think about what it means to be part of these transnational families, youth are having, thinking about goals that they would like to pursue here in the US, but also thinking about their commitments to their homes, their families back, in this case, Guatemala. The last case that I want to bring to your attention is Amada, who was seeking asylum from El Salvador. She had at one point thought that she wanted to study forensics, but as she told me, she realized it was a very long career. And here, I am highlighting other aspirations that she has, like getting married at 19 or 20, having children. So she wanted to be a young mother. In addition, she wanted to have a car, have a house, travel the world. And so all of these aspirations, even though they're not about college or careers, they're still very much valid. And I think, it's worthy of our attention as educators. And in terms of her aspirations of becoming a mother, and I want to bring your attention to something she shared about how she was undecided about whether she should stay here in the US or be in El Salvador, because she's actually thinking about what would happen if she decided one day to leave for El Salvador, and really this idea that she might not be able to take her kids with her, right? So she doesn't yet have kids, and it's really this idea of, this future family, and so it's and yet she has this worry, and it's part of, it's not an unfounded fear, because we know that current administrations and past administrations have separated families, in the immigrant community, whether it's when they arrive at the border or just through deportation. But she's already playing out the scenario that in, her current context, she can't live out a transnational life as a Salvadoran mother to, mother to future US born children. So what does this all mean, right? To conclude, newcomer youth are thinking about their futures, and oftentimes it is at the margins. We see how some of them are alluding to even just like their undocumentedness, or the fact that, they're still adjusting their legal status. And it's very real how the US is categorizing people and, therefore affording them certain privileges and not others, right? And then again, we are even seeing how youth are thinking beyond borders, right? Even though at the very, it is very real how they're being constrained and contained. And so what does this mean for us educators who are looking to prepare them for their futures? One of the things that we can do, is talk about their futures, and to do so early. Most of the newcomer youth, especially the older newcomer youth, talked about how no one was really asking them what their long-term goals were. And if they were asked that question, it happened their spring semester of their junior year, or even, the fall of their senior year. There were not a lot of collaborations that were happening with school counselors, or I guess one thing that you could do is collaborate with school counselors, since they are tasked to attend to students' college and career readiness, right? The other thing is to really disseminate information about their rights as undocumented students. So California is rich in resources for the undocumented community. A lot of these things you might know of, like AB 540, the fact that we have access to in-state tuition, loans, but then there's also these other things like being able to pursue professional licensing in 40 different professions, the fact that undocumented youth can pursue apprenticeships and internships. This is especially relevant to those who are pursuing careers in post-secondary education and community colleges. So this is all information that youth need to know about. And I bring this up because when I was talking to Newcomer youth about the access that they had to resources like this, most of them said they did not know, right? And these are things that have been in the legislation, you know, for a decade now, like the California Dream Act, or even, you know, AB 540 for now more than 20 years. So not knowing can no longer be, should not be an excuse, or, you know, it's just not, with these many resources, it should not be happening. Again, the other thing is that we should be talking about the importance of youth pursuing post-secondary education and training, because if they want to become small business owners, they still, you know, need the training for whatever business that they want to, you know, put on, or, you know, if they want to become independent contractors. I encourage you all to look up the resources that Immigrants Rising has, but being an entrepreneur, being a small business owner, an expert in, you know, whatever product you're trying to sell, you know, they would still benefit from post-secondary education. And then the other thing is, again, really attending to how they are continuing to be members of transnational families, right? Just because they're here, it doesn't mean that they're divorced from their families, and how their families are still shaping their future goals. And so I know some people use WhatsApp to communicate with families here in the US, but also, you know, thinking about what that would mean if we wanted to bring into conversation parents that are, you know, in Guatemala, Mexico. I know one colleague right now who's doing work with using WhatsApp to connect to former teachers and having them be able to inform conversations about, you know, what the educational experiences have been, are now for youth here in the US. And so with that being said, thank you for your time. Here's my email. And I look forward to the questions that you can all pose in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Sophia Ángeles, for sharing your data and your research. And now we want to open up for questions, comments. You can use the Q&A box or the chat. I'm going to start with a question. I have a question. In your presentation, you mentioned that you also interviewed administrators and teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you maybe like share us some of the insights that you found from those interviews or conversations that you had, or observations that you made?
Yeah. Like, is there anything specific that you haven't, like, just in general?
In general, but for example, this concept of the students not having information or not accessing or not being aware of, is there, did the administrators address that, of how come some of the students are not aware of what's happening, or even the options they're giving them in terms of about community college versus a UC or other options?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, it seems like, so not all educators were aware. I think, you know, the teachers that had more of a personal relationship, or, you know, they were maybe like the ELD teacher or like the teacher coach. The school counselor actually was working with some of the local LA organizations to have conversations about, in 2021, I think there was conversations in Congress about, you know, like doing a pathway for youth to adjust their legal status. So that did happen. But it seemed, when I'd asked them about like what information they had about financial aid, it seems like there wasn't really like conversations happening about like the difference about the DREAM Act or like FAFSA. And if it did happen, again, it happened when they were older. So they were seniors, and that's when they were hearing about it versus, having these conversations at the very beginning so that they could really take into account, you're here for 4 years, you're here for 3 years. And now with California policy, students can actually do a 5th year. What does that look like? So like, backwards planning. I think the other thing that I don't touch about here is just, this idea of what it means to be a language learner. And so a lot of the reason why they aren't able to be eligible for college is because they get tracked into ELD courses or ESL, and none of those courses count for, like the English component. They're not considered a college prep course until I think the very last one. And that's something that this particular high school was actually trying to address, opening up access to college prep coursework. But at the same time, there are some teachers that were a little more hesitant, like, why are they in my English class, or, why are they in my AP history class? So like all these things that kind of help develop students' academic readiness. So those are some of the things that came out of those interviews.
Thank you. And we actually have some questions here in the chat. The first one is regarding your literature review. So aside from Abrego and Hinderbrick's work, is there additional literature that you consulted for your literature review that informed your work and research questions?
Yeah, so there's there's a scholar, I believe she's at Boston University right now, Yasuko Kano. She's been focusing on, she actually just had a book that came out, I believe in 2021, that looks at the experiences of high school EL. So she doesn't really focus so much per se on the immigrant experience, but on the EL experience of high school students. And she has written about how ELs, at least at the high school, tend to graduate neither college or career ready. I think she talks about them as being like the undeserved, neither college or career ready, like they just end up graduating high school without really any opportunities to pursue post-secondary education. There's also the work of Rebecca Callahan. There's someone up in Oregon. There's like different, Megan Hopkins has also, she's down at UC San Diego. So there's a couple of scholars that have been looking at the experiences of ELs in like the secondary context, and kind of how they, just have really limited opportunities. They end up being tracked, excluded. So there's a lot of exclusion that's happening. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Victor Zuniga. Could you talk about the 45 students in your sample who are temporarily in the US?
Yeah, so I use temporary just because they are, with the exception of one, they were all seeking asylum. Some of them had arrived as unaccompanied minors, and then the other were seeking asylum. They actually came with a family member, and together they were seeking asylum. So I talk about, how other scholars have also talked about how asylum seekers tend to be deportees in waiting and citizens in waiting at the same time, like they're kind of in this limbo. And so I kind of categorize them as temporary just because they're still waiting to really see how their case plays out. And for, I guess, in terms of like generalities, that population was most of them were coming from Guatemala, but there were some that were from El Salvador and Honduras. So mostly that population was Central American. And I would say that among those that were seeking asylum, those that had arrived older, there were a couple of things. They were looking to graduate earlier, so in 3 years, and if they were looking to graduate earlier, it's usually because they were interested in immediately entering the workforce. And in general, some of them would speak to this idea that, you know, if I have papers, this is the route that I could take. If I don't have papers, you know, this is the route that I will be taking.
Thank you. It seems like, you know, that's your sample like of students have a different level of awareness of the resources, you know, and I'm really impressed on how much they see their future, like in terms of I'm so amazed with Amada that she's not even a mother yet, and she already knows like how important it is, the papers, to determine all these different choices and career choices and life choices that they're going to be making.
No, you know, I think her and maybe like another, just, you know, like even having these conversations about, I want to be a dad, I want to be a mom. A lot of them mentioned wanting to become homeowners, right? So, you know, in the context of California, where even, you know, young professionals can't afford to buy a home, what does it mean when we have youth that are graduating and are able to pursue post-secondary education? And again, this is, you know, beyond just thinking of four-year colleges. One of the things that actually happened that came up with the interviews with the college and actually with the administrators is just like this big push for youth to go to four-year colleges. But as we see, not all careers require a four-year college, and there are some careers that, you know, with a 2-year degree or even like apprenticeship program, you know, you can be making a you know, better wages sometimes than people who have pursued four-year colleges. But again, you know, what does it mean to maybe not have adjusted your legal status or be undocumented, and you are thinking about becoming a homeowner? So again, their aspirations were, they were thinking about everything. And so how do we as educators attend to all of that?
Definitely. And can you share us your experience in interviewing these students? Because, you know, given their backgrounds and their immigration trajectories, especially the unaccompanied minors, did these interviews trigger any like emotional breakdowns? How was that experience doing this kind of labor?
I let them start wherever they wanted to start. So I wasn't, again, because the focus, I know some, you know, scholars actually really do look at the migration experience, or, you know, what that really means for them. So I would just let them, you know, I think the first question was just like, tell me about how you arrived to LA. Some of the students, and again, I think being cognizant that they have, especially those who have been seeking asylum, have been undergone a lot of questioning. You know, I would always just say, like, you know, start where you want to start. So some youth did go into more detail about, you know, just like even migrating. Some of them did go into detail about being detained at the border, but that wasn't something that I was, you know, like pushing for them to share with me if they didn't, you know, they didn't feel comfortable. I think in terms of the question about legal status, it really came out when we were talking about the access that they had to financial aid and what they knew and what it would mean, you know, if they did have citizenship, or if they had papeles. That's where it really came out. But I really tried to, you know, not come off as like trying to like be invasive, you know, get these stories just because I wanted to hear them.
Well, thank you for sharing. We have 2 more questions here. I'll read both of them and you decide what order you want to read. What would be the impact of these students if these students would have connected with educated immigrants who had pursued post-secondary training in high school affected their choices? And then another one for Victor Zúñiga. Do you think high school educators in the US will be open to talk with their students about the post-secondary education opportunities in their parents' countries of origin? It might be useful for the students who have a double nationality. And then we have another one in Spanish. ¿Ha creado la escuela algún tipo de colaboración con alguna universidad a través de la cual estudiantes universitarios que han tenido experiencias similares a los estudiantes entrevistados se convierten en mentores?
Yeah, so in regards to Carla's question, no, todavía no. I think the population of I think the population that is like pursuing college, is growing, but they haven't been able to do like an alumni like mentoring. Something that they wanted to do was like seniors mentor freshmen, but then that stopped because of the pandemic. But yes, mentorship I think is very important. In terms of the question about being able to hear about other educated immigrants, the school did actually start, what did they call it? Career Fun Fridays, where they would, because of Zoom, they were purposefully trying to bring in immigrant adults who had immigrated, or like children of immigrants, or immigrant adults who had immigrated as youth, to talk about their experiences with college, and that seemed to trigger thinking about the possibilities or opportunities that were available to them. But I think one of the complaints, or one of the things that students would say is, that really creating those programs to be tailored to their interests, because at that point the school was just trying to get anybody who would come, and there were certain careers that the students were interested in, but no one was talking about that. And in terms of Dr. Zúñiga's question, I think it's something that we should be doing. In particular regarding school counselors, I don't think that's something that like they receive training in terms of thinking about post-secondary opportunities like abroad. But giving the growing transnational students that we have, I think that is something that educators need to, we need to do better training, so that we can talk about these opportunities to pursue post-secondary education. And again, not being limited by like just studying in the US, because, as Mr. Sandoval said, the US is better.